Oh, okay, sorry. Yes. Hello. I did not go to school today. And also my soda's in a can and not a cup. So I'm going to read the rest of chapter 12. Let me see. So I'm just going to read all of it. There is one part. So the Uneasy Missouri Compromise, I'm going to read all of that because that goes past the Makers of America. And then once I finish the Uneasy Missouri Compromise, I'm going to go back a page, read Makers of America, and then read John Marshall and the Judicial Nationalism. Oh, so much reading. Stupid textbook. Okay, let's see. Slavery and the Sectional Balance. Oh, that's right. I'm starting on page 236. Anyways, slavery and the sectional balance. Sectional tensions involving rivalry between the slave South and free North over control of the beckoning West were suddenly underscored in 1819. In that year, the territory of Missouri knocked on the doors of Congress for admission as a slave state. This fertile and well-watered area contained sufficient population to warrant statehood, but the House of Representatives stymied the plans of the Missourians by passing an incendiary Talmadge Amendment. It stipulated that no more slaves should be brought into Missouri and also provided for the gradual emancipation of children born to enslaved parents already there. A roar of anger burst from slaveholding Southerners. They were joined by many Depression-cursed pioneers who favored unhampered expansion of the West, and by many Northerners, especially die-hard Federalists, who were eager to use the issue to break the back of the Virginia dynasty. Southerners saw in the Talmadge Amendment, which they eventually managed to defeat in the Senate, an ominous threat to sectional balance. When the Constitution was adopted in 1788, the North and South were running neck and neck in wealth and population. But with every passing decade, the North was becoming wealthier and also more thickly settled, and an advantage reflected in an increasing Northern majority in the House of Representatives. Yet in the Senate, each state had 2 votes, regardless of size. With 11 states free and 11 slave, the Southerners had maintained equality. They were therefore in a good position to thwart any Northern effort to interfere with the expansion of slavery, and they did not want to lose this veto. The future of the slave system caused Southerners profound concern. Missouri was the first state entirely west of the Mississippi River to be carved out of the Louisiana Purchase, and the Missouri Emancipation Amendment might set a damaging precedent for all the rest of the area. Even more disquieting was another possibility. If Congress could abolish the peculiar institution in Missouri, might it not attempt to do likewise in the older states of the South? The wounds of the Constitutional Convention of 1787 were once more ripped open. Burning moral questions also protruded, even though the main issue was political and economic balance. A small but growing group of anti-slavery agitators in the North seized the occasion to raise an outcry against the evils of slavery. They were determined that the plague of human bondage should not spread further into untainted territories. The Uneasy Missouri Compromise. Deadlock in Washington was at length broken in 1820 by the time-honored American solution of compromise. Actually, a bundle of 3 compromises. Courtly Henry Clay of Kentucky, a gifted conciliator, played a leading role. Congress, despite abolitionist pleas, agreed to admit Missouri as a slave state. But at the time, Free Soil, Maine, which until then had been a part of the Massachusetts, was admitted as a separate state. The balance between North and South was thus kept at 12 states each and remained there for 15 years. Although Missouri was permitted to retain slaves, all future bondage was prohibited in the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase north of the line 3630, the southern boundary of Missouri. This horse trading adjustment was politically even-handed, though denounced by extremists on each side as a dirty bargain. Both North and South yielded something. Both gained something. The South won the prize of Missouri as an unrestricted slave state. The North won the concession that Congress could forbid slavery in the remaining territories. More gratifying to many Northerners was the fact that this immense area north of 3630, except Missouri, was forever closed to the blight of slavery. Yet the restriction on future slavery in the territories was not unduly offensive to the slave owners, partly because the northern prairie land did not seem suited to slave labor. Even so, a majority of Southern congressmen still voted against the compromise. Neither North nor South was acutely displeased, although neither was completely happy. The Missouri Compromise lasted 34 years, a vital formative period in the life of the young republic, and during that time it preserved the shaky compact of the states. Yet the embittered dispute over slavery heralded the future breakup of the Union. Even after, the morality of the South's peculiar institution was an issue that could not be swept under the rug. The Missouri Compromise only ducked the question. It did not resolve it. Sooner or later, Thomas Jefferson predicted, it will burst on us as a tornado. The Missouri Compromise and the concurrent panic of 1819 should have dimmed the political star of President Monroe. Certainly, both unhappy events had a dampening effect on the era of good feelings. But smooth-spoken James Monroe was so popular and the Federalist opposition so weak that even in the presidential election of 1820, he received every electoral vote except one. Unanimity was an honor reserved for George Washington. Monroe, as it turned out, was the only president in American history to be re-elected after a term in which a major financial panic began. Settlers of the Old Northwest, makers of America. The Old Northwest beckoned to settlers after the War of 1812. The withdrawal of the British protector weakened the Indians' grip on the territory. Then the transportation boom of the 1820s, steamboats on the Ohio, the National Highway stretching from Pennsylvania, the Erie Canal, opened broad arteries along which the westward movement flowed. The first wave of newcomers came mainly from Kentucky, Tennessee, and the upland regions of Virginia and the Carolinas. Most migrants were rough-hewn white farmers who had been pushed from a good land to bad by an expanding plantation economy. Like Joseph Kress of North Carolina, they were relieved to relinquish them old red fields where you get nothing in return for acres of new soil that is as black and rich you wold want it. Okay. Some settlers acquired land for the first time. John Palmer, whose family left Kentucky for Illinois in 1831, recalled his father telling him of land so cheap that we could all be landholders, where men were all equal. Migrants from the South settled mainly in southern portions of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. As Palmer testified, the Old Northwest offered southern farmers an escape from the lowly social position they had endured as non-slaveholders in a slave society. Not that they objected to slavery or sympathized with blacks. Far from it. By enacting black codes in their new territories, they tried to prevent blacks from following them to paradise. They wanted their own democratic community, free of rich planters and African Americans alike. If southern butternuts, as these settlers recalled, dominated settlement in the 1820s, the next decade brought Yankees from the northeast. They were as land-starved as their southern counterparts. A growing population had gobbled up most of the good land east of the Appalachians. Yankee settlers came to the Old Northwest, especially to the northern parts of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, eager to make the region a profitable breadbasket for the Atlantic seaboard. Unlike the butternuts who wanted to quit forever the imposing framework of southern society, northerners hoped to recreate the world they had left behind. Conflict soon emerged between Yankees and Southerners. As self-sufficient farmers with little interest in producing for the market, the Southerners viewed the northern newcomers as inhospitable, greedy, and excessively ambitious. Yankee became a term of reproach. A person who was cheated was said to have been Yankeed. Northerners, in turn, viewed the Southerners as uncivilized, a coon dog and butcher knife tribe, with no interest in education, self-improvement, or agricultural innovation. Yankees, eager to tame both the land and its people, wanted to establish public schools and build roads, canals, and railroads, and they advocated taxes to fund such progress. Southerners opposed all these reforms, especially public schooling, which they regarded as an attempt to northernize their children. Religion divided settlers as well. Northerners, typically Congregationalists and Presbyterians, wanted their ministers to be educated in seminaries. Southerners embraced to more revivalist Baptist and Methodist denominations. They preferred humbled preacher farmers to professionally trained clergymen, whom they viewed as too distant from the Lord and the people. As the preacher Alexander Campbell, a founder of the Disciples of Christ, it's disciples, right? Disciples of Christ put it, the scheme of a learned priesthood has long since proved itself to be a grand device to keep men in ignorance and bondage. Not everyone, of course, fitted neatly into these molds. Abraham Lincoln, with roots in Kentucky, came to adopt views more akin to those of the Yankees and the Southerners, whereas his New England-born arch-rival, Stephen Douglas, carefully cultivated the butternut vote for the Illinois Democratic Party. As the population swelled and the region acquired its own character, the stark contrasts between Northerners and Southerners started to fade. By the 1850s, Northerners dominated numerically, and they succeeded in establishing public schools and fashioning internal improvements. Railroads and the Great Lakes shipping tied the region ever more tightly to the northeast. Yankees and Southerners sometimes allied as new kinds of cleavages emerged, between rich and poor, between city dwellers and farmers, and, once Irish and German immigrants started pouring into the region, between native Protestants and newcomer Catholics. Still, echoes of the clash between Yankees and butternuts persisted. During the Civil War, the southern counties of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, where Southerners had first settled, harbored sympathizers with the South and served as a key area for Confederate military infiltration into the North. Decades later, these same counties became a stronghold of the Ku Klux Klan. The North Old West may have become firmly anchored economically to the Northeast, but vestiges of its early dual personality persisted. Whew. Let me take a Okay. John Marshall and Wow, I died. Okay. John Marshall and judicial nationalism. Excuse me. The upsurging nationalism of the post-Ghent years, despite the ominous setbacks concerning slavery, was further reflected and reinforced by the Supreme Court. Where'd it go? The High Tribunal continued to be dominated by the tall, thin, and aggressive Chief Justice John Marshall. One group of his decisions, perhaps the most famous, bolstered the power of the federal government at the expense of the states. A notable case in this category was McCulloch v. Maryland. This suit involved an attempt by the state of Maryland to destroy a branch of the Bank of the United States by imposing a tax on its notes. John Marshall, speaking for the court, declared the bank constitutional by invoking the Hamiltonian doctrine of implied powers. At the same time, he strengthened federal authority and slapped at state infringements when he denied the right of Maryland to tax the bank. With ringing emphasis, he affirmed the power to tax involves the power to destroy, and that a power to create implies a power to preserve. Marshall's ruling in this case gave the doctrine of loose construction its most famous formulation. The Constitution, he said, derived from the consent of the people, and thus permitted the government to act for their benefit. He further argued that the Constitution was intended to endure for ages to come, and consequently to be adapted to the various crises of human affairs. Finally, he declared, let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consist with letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. 2 years later, the case of Cohens v. Virginia gave Marshall one of his greatest opportunities to defend the federal power. The Cohen brothers, found guilty by the Virginia courts of illegally selling lottery tickets, appealed to the highest tribunal. Virginia won in the sense that the conviction of Cohens was upheld, but in fact Virginia and all the individual states lost, because Marshall resoundingly asserted the right of the Supreme Court to review the decisions of the state Supreme Courts in all questions involving powers of the federal government. The states' rights proponents were aghast. Hardly less significant was the celebrated steamboat case, Gibbons v. Ogden. The suit grew out of an attempt by the state of New York to grant to a private concern a monopoly of waterborne commerce between New York and New Jersey. Marshall sternly reminded the upstart state that the Constitution conferred on Congress alone the control of the interstate commerce. He thus struck with one hand another blow at states' rights, while upholding with the other the sovereign powers of the federal government. Interstate streams were cleared of this judicial snag. The departed spirit of Hamilton may have well applauded. Judicial dikes against democratic excesses. Another sheaf of Marshall's decisions bolstered judicial barriers against democratic or demagogic attacks on property rights. The notorious case of Fletcher v. Peck arose when a Georgia legislator, swayed by bribery, granted 35 million acres in the Yazoo River country, Mississippi, to private speculators. The next legislator, yielding to an angry public outcry, canceled the crooked transaction. But the Supreme Court, with Marshall presiding, decreed that the legislative grant was a contract, even though fraudulently secured, and that the Constitution forbids state laws impairing contracts. The decision was perhaps most noteworthy as further protecting property rights against popular pressures. It was also one of the earliest clear assertions of the right of the Supreme Court to invalidate state laws conflicting with the federal Constitution. A similar principle was upheld in the case of Dartmouth College v. Woodward, among the best remembered of Marshall's cases. The college had been granted a charter by King George III in 1769, but the Democratic New Hampshire state legislature had seen fit to change it. Dartmouth appealed to the case, employing as counsel its most distinguished alumnus, Daniel Webster. The godlike Daniel reportedly pulled out of all stops his tear-inducing eloquence when he declaimed, It is, sir, as I have said, a small college, and yet there are those who love it." Marshall needed no dramatics in the Dartmouth case. He put the states firmly in their place when he ruled that the original charter must stand. It was a contract, and the Constitution protected contracts against state encroachments. The Dartmouth decision had the fortunate effect of safeguarding business's enterprise from domination by the state governments. But it had the unfortunate effect of creating a precedent that enabled chartered corporation, in later years, to escape the handcuffs of needed public control. If John Marshall was a molding father of the Constitution, Daniel Webster was an expounding father. Time and again he left his seat in the Senate, stepped downstairs to the Supreme Court chamber, then located in the Capitol building, and there expounded his federalistic and nationalistic philosophy before the Supreme Bench. The eminent Chief Justice, so Webster reported, approvingly drank in the familiar arguments as a baby sucks in its mother's milk. The two men dovetailed strikingly with each other. Webster's classic speeches in the Senate, challenging states' rights and nullification, were largely repetitious, oh my goodness, repetitious of the arguments that he had earlier presented before a sympathetic Supreme Court. Marshall's decisions are felt even today. In this sense, his nationalism was the most tenaciously enduring of the area. He buttressed the federal union and helped to create a stable, nationally uniform environment for business. At the same time, Marshall checked the excesses of popularity elected state legislatures. In an age when white manhood suffrage was flowering and America was veering towards stronger popular control, Marshall almost single-handedly shaped the Constitution along conservative, centralizing lines that ran somewhat counter to the dominant spirit of the new country. Through him, the conservative Hamiltonians partly triumphed from the tomb. Sharing Oregon and acquiring Florida, the robust nationalism of the years after the War of 1812 was likewise reflected in the shaping of foreign policy. To this end, the nationalistic President Monroe teamed with his nationalistic Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, and the cold and scholarly son of the frosty and bookish ex-president. The younger Adams, a statesman of the first rank, happily rose above the ingrown Federalist sectionalism of his native New England and proved to be one of the greatest Secretaries of State. To its credit, the Monroe administration negotiated the much underrated Anglo-American Convention of 1818 with Britain. This pact permitted Americans to share the coveted Newfoundland fisheries with their Canadian cousins. This multi-sided agreement also fixed the vague northern limits of the Louisiana along the 49th parallel from the Lake of the Woods, Minnesota, to the Rocky Mountains. The treaty further provided for a 10-year joint occupation of the untamed Oregon country, without a surrender of the rights or claims of either America or Britain. To the south lay a semi-tropical Spanish Florida, which many Americans believed geography and providence had destined to become part of the United States. Americans already claimed West Florida, where uninvited American settlers had torn down the hated Spanish flag in 1810. Congress ratified this grab in 1812, and during the War of 1812 against Spain's ally, Britain, a small American army seized the mobile region, but the bulk of Florida remained, tauntingly, under Spanish rule. An epidemic of revolutions now broke out in South America, notably in Chile, Venezuela, and Argentina, and Americans instinctively cheered the birth of these sister republics, though the checkered histories of the Latin democracy soon provided grounds for disappointment. But the upheavals in the southern continent forced Spain to denude Florida of troops in a vain effort to squelch the rebels. General Andrew Jackson, idol of the West and scourge of the Indians, saw opportunity in the undefended swamplands. On the pretext that hostile Seminole Indians and fugitive slaves were using Florida as refuge, Jackson secured a commission to enter Spanish territory, punish the Indians, and recapture the runaways, but he was to respect all posts under the Spanish flag. Early in 1818, Jackson swept across Florida border with all the fury of an avenging angel. He hanged 2 Indian chiefs without ceremony and, after hasty military trials, executed 2 British subjects for assisting the Indians. He also seized the 2 most important Spanish posts in the area, St. Mark's and then Pensacola, where he deposed the Spanish governor, who was lucky enough to escape Jackson's jerking noose. Jackson had clearly exceeded his instructions from Washington. Alarmed, President Monroe consulted his cabinet. Its members were for disavowing or disciplining the overzealous Jackson, all except the lone wolf John Quincy Adams, who refused to howl with the pack. Oh, sorry, I dropped something. Who refused to howl with the pack. An ardent patriot and nationalist, the flinty New Englander took the offensive and demanded huge concessions from Spain. In the mislabeled Florida Purchase Treaty of 1819, also known as the Adams-Onis Treaty? Hold on, I gotta take a sip. Spain ceded Florida as well as shadowy Spanish claims to Oregon in exchange for America's abandonment of equally murky claims to Texas, soon to become part of the independent Mexico. The hitherto vague western boundary of Louisiana was made to zigzag northwesterly toward the Rockies to the 42nd parallel, and then to turn due west to the Pacific, dividing Oregon from Spanish holdings. The menace of monarchy in America. After the Napoleonic nightmare, the rethroned autocrats of Europe banded together in a kind of monarchical protective association. Determined to restore the good old days, they undertook to stamp out the democratic tendencies that had sprouted from soil they considered richly manured by the ideals of the French Revolution. The world must be made safe from democracy. The crown despots acted promptly. With complete ruthlessness, they smothered the embers of popular rebellions in Italy and in Spain. According to the Europeans' rumor factory, they were also gazing across the Atlantic, Russia, Austria, Prussia, and France, acting in partnership, would presumably send powerful fleets and armies to the revolted colonies of Spanish America and there restore the autocratic Spanish king to his ancestral domains. Many Americans were alarmed. Naturally sympathetic to democratic revolutions, they had cheered when Latin American republics rose from the ruins of monarchy. Americans feared that if the European powers intervened in the New World, the cause of republicanism would suffer irreparable harm. The physical security of the United States, the mother lode of democracy, would be endangered by the proximity of powerful and unfriendly forces. The southward push of the Russian Bear from the chilly region now known as Alaska had already publicized the menace of monarchy to North America. In 1821, the Tsar of Russia issued a decree extending Russian jurisdiction over 100 miles of open sea down the line of 51 degrees, an area that embraced most of the coast of present-day British Columbia. The energetic Russians had already established trading posts almost as far down south as the entrance to San Francisco Bay. Fort Ross is a corruption of Russian, still stands today on the coast of Sonoma County, California. The fear prevailed in the United States that the Russians were planning to cut the Republic off from California, its prospective window on the Pacific. Great Britain, still ruler of the seas, was now beginning to play a lone hand role in the complicated international stage. In particular, it recoiled from joining hands with the continental European powers in crushing the newly won liberties of Spanish Americans. These revolutionaries had thrown open their monopoly-bound ports to outside trade, and British shippers, as well as Americans, had found the profits sweet. Accordingly, in August 1823, George Canning, the haughty British Foreign Secretary, approached the American minister in London with a startling proposition. Would the United States combine with Britain in a joint declaration renouncing any interest in acquiring Latin American territory and specifically warning the European despots to keep their harsh hands off the Latin American republics? The American minister, lacking instructions, referred this fatal scheme to his superiors in Washington. Monroe and his doctrine. The tenacious nationalist Secretary Adams was hard-headed enough to be wary of Britain's bearing gifts. Why should the lordly British, with the mightiest navy afloat, need America as an ally, an America that had neither naval nor military strength? Such a union, argued Adams, was undignified, like a tiny American cockboat sailing in the wake of the British man of war. Adams, ever alert, thought that he detected the joker in the Canning proposal. The British feared that the aggressive Yankees would one day seize Spanish territory in the Americas, perhaps Cuba, which would jeopardize Britain's possessions of the Caribbean. If Canning could seduce the United States into joining with him in the support of the territorial integrity of the New World, America's own hands would be morally tied. A self-denying alliance with Britain would not only hamper American expansion, concluded Adams, but it was also unnecessary. He suspected, correctly, that the European powers had not hatched any definite plans for invading the Americas. In any event, the British Navy would prevent the approach of hostile fleets because the South American markets had to be kept open at all costs for British merchants. It was presumably safe for Uncle Sam, behind the protective wooden petticoats of the British Navy, to blow a defiant, nationalistic blast of all Europe. The distresses of the Old World set the stage once again for an American diplomatic coup. The Monroe Doctrine was born late in 1823, when the nationalistic Adams won the nationalistic Monroe over to his way of thinking. The President, in his regular annual message to Congress on December 2, 1823, incorporated a stern warning to the European powers. Its two basic features were 1. Non-colonization, and 2. Non-intervention. Monroe first directed his verbal volley primarily at the lumbering Russian Bear in the Northwest. He proclaimed, in effect, that the era of colonization in the Americas had ended, and that henceforth the hunting season was permanently closed. What the great powers had they might keep, but neither they nor any old world governments could seize otherwise acquire more. At the same time, Monroe trumpeted a warning against foreign intervention. He was clearly concerned with the regions to the south, where fears were felt for fledgling Spanish-American republics. Monroe bluntly directed the crowned heads of Europe to keep their hated monarchical systems out of this hemisphere. For its part, the United States would not intervene in the war that the Greeks were then fighting against the Turks for their independence. Monroe's doctrine appraised. The aligned monarchs of Europe were angered at Monroe's doctrine. Having resented the incendiary American experiment from the beginning, they were now deeply offended by Monroe's high-flown declaration, all the more so because of the gulf between America's pretentious pronouncements and its puny military strength. But though offended by the upstart Yankees, the European powers found their hands tied, and their frustration increased their annoyance. Even if they had worked out plans for invading the Americas, they would have been helpless before the booming broadsides of the British Navy. Monroe's solemn warning, when issued, made little splash in the newborn republics to the south. Anyone could see that Uncle Sam was only secondarily concerned about his neighbors because he was primarily concerned about defending himself against future invasion. Only a relatively few educated Latin Americans knew of the message, and they generally recognized that the British Navy, not the paper pronouncement of James Monroe, stood between them and a hostile Europe. In truth, Monroe's message did not have much contemporary significance. Americans applauded it and then forgot it. Not until 1845 did President Polk revive it, and not until mid-century did it become an important national dogma. Even before Monroe's stiff message, the Tsar had decided to retreat. This he formally did in the Russo-American Treaty of 1824, which fixed his southernmost limits at the line of 5440, the present southern tip of the Alaska Panhandle. The Monroe Doctrine might more accurately have been called the Self-Defense Doctrine. President Monroe was concerned basically with the security of his own country, not of Latin America. The United States has never willingly permitted a powerful foreign nation to secure a foothold near its strategic Caribbean vitals. Yet in the absence of the British Navy or other allies, the strength of the Monroe Doctrine has never been greater than America's power to eject the trespasser. This doctrine, as often noted, was just as big as the nation's armed forces, and no bigger. The Monroe Doctrine has had a long career of ups and downs. It was never law, domestic or international. It was not, technically speaking, a pledge or an agreement. It was merely a simple, personalized statement of the policy of President Monroe. What one president says, another must unsay. And Monroe's successors have ignored, revived, distorted, or expanded the original version, chiefly by adding interpretations. Like ivy on a tree, it has grown with America's growth. But the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 was largely an expression of the post-1812 nationalism energizing the United States. Although directed at a specific menace in 1823, and hence a kind of period piece, the doctrine proved to be most famous of all the long-lived offspring of that nationalism. While giving voice to a spirit of patriotism, it simultaneously deepened the illusion of isolationism. Many Americans falsely concluded, then and later, that the Republic was in fact insulated from European danger simply because it wanted to be, and because, in a nationalistic outburst, Monroe had publicly warned the old world powers to stay away. And that's the end of the chapter.